Does the federal government have the authority to tax American citizens? Ed, Elaine Brown and their supporters don't think so. In this video, we will go step by step through what happened to the Browns, from their tax-related trial and conviction, through their months-long standoff with law enforcement. We will also discuss some of the beliefs and laws surrounding U.S. personal income taxes, whether the federal government truly has the power to force you to pay them, and even if a federal government is legitimate without consent of the governed. For those of you who haven't heard ideas like this before, keep an open mind and ask yourself some tough questions. This is the story of Ed and Elaine Brown and the system they refused to obey. In the rolling hills of Plainfield, New Hampshire, Ed and Elaine Brown lived a life that, at first glance, seemed unremarkable. Elaine, a dedicated dentist, ran the Half-Hollow Dental Center in West Lebanon, providing care to her community. Ed, a retired exterminator, had settled into a quieter pace of life. But beneath this veneer of normalcy lay a deep-seated conviction. The Browns held a firm belief that the federal government lacked the authority to impose income taxes on American citizens. This perspective wasn't born out of ignorance, but from their belief in a natural law superseding man's law. They viewed the federal income tax system as illegitimate, a deviation from the nation's founding principles. Their stance wasn't merely theoretical. The Browns acted on their beliefs, choosing not to pay federal income taxes, asserting that doing so would legitimize what they saw as an illegitimate system. This decision set them on a collision course with federal authorities, leading to legal battles that would test the limits of civil disobedience and governmental power. As their case unfolded, the Browns became symbols to many who questioned federal authority. Supporters saw them as patriots standing up for natural rights, while critics viewed their actions as defiance of the rule of law. Regardless of perspective, the Browns' story ignited a national conversation about the scope of federal power and the rights of citizens. In the next few minutes, we'll delve deeper into the Browns' legal journey, the standoff that captured national attention, and the broader implications of their actions on the American legal and political landscape. By 2006, the federal government had made its move. After years of defiance, Ed and Elaine Brown were indicted on multiple counts related to tax evasion. Prosecutors alleged the couple hadn't paid income taxes since 1996 and failed to file returns after 1998. The government claimed they owed more than $625,000 in federal taxes on nearly $1.9 million in income, much of it from Elaine's dental clinic in West Lebanon. But if the Browns were concerned, they didn't show it. Instead of pleading out like most in their position, they doubled down. Ed, in particular, refused to even recognize the authority of the court. He represented himself and challenged the legitimacy of the federal income tax system itself, claiming no law existed that required him, or anyone, to pay it. Elaine, though less vocal, also initially represented herself, though she later accepted a court-appointed lawyer partway through the trial. The proceedings moved forward in the U.S. District Court in Concord, New Hampshire. Ed began skipping court altogether, stating openly that he didn't recognize the court's authority and would not submit to what he called a fictional system. He remained at his home in Plainfield, giving interviews to local radio and telling the world, "Show me the law, and I'll pay." On January 18, 2007, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. Ed was convicted of conspiracy to defraud the United States and structuring financial transactions to evade federal reporting requirements. Elaine was convicted of conspiracy, 5 counts of tax evasion, 8 counts of failing to collect and pay employee taxes, and 2 additional charges related to financial structuring. Each faced more than 5 years in federal prison. But the convictions did not lead to immediate arrests. Elaine, unlike Ed, complied with court orders. At first, she was released on bail, fitted with an electronic ankle monitor, and ordered to remain at her son's home in Worcester, Massachusetts. Her movements were restricted. She could only leave if her son accompanied her. Weeks later, Elaine violated her release terms. She removed the ankle monitor and returned to Plainfield. From that point on, both Browns became fugitives. Before the federal government could carry out the sentences, the couple disappeared into their property with enough supplies to last for months. To their supporters, they were taking a stand against government tyranny. To federal prosecutors, they were now fugitives defying the rule of law. What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Their refusal to appear for sentencing would soon snowball into one of the longest and most notorious standoffs in modern American legal history. The Browns made their position clear. They would never surrender to what they believed was an illegitimate federal government enforcing an unjust tax, and if anyone came to take them, they wouldn't be going quietly. The Browns' property, a 110-acre parcel in the woods, soon became more than a home. It became a fortress. In recorded statements, Ed declared they were prepared to resist with force, stating, "We either walk out of here free or we die." Federal authorities, having witnessed past tragedies like Waco and Ruby Ridge, were cautious. The U.S. Marshals Service made the deliberate decision to avoid a confrontation. Rather than storming the property, they established a perimeter, observed, and waited. Surveillance teams kept watch while federal prosecutors worked behind the scenes to manage the escalating situation. Meanwhile, the Browns didn't just sit quietly. They turned their standoff into a platform. Ed posted online audio updates, gave interviews, and opened the property to supporters from around the country. Those who arrived were often sympathetic to anti-tax and sovereign citizen ideologies. Some stayed for days, helping fortify the property or delivering supplies. One visitor, Danny Riley, would later be indicted alongside the Browns for aiding them in obstructing federal justice. Another, Jason Gerhardt, a young Marine, abandoned his military post and traveled from Utah to join the Browns in what he believed was a stand for liberty. These weren't mere bystanders. Several were later charged with transporting weapons, constructing improvised explosives, and helping conceal the Browns' location from law enforcement. Among those who visited the Browns during the standoff was Randy Weaver, the man whose family became the center of the infamous 1992 Ruby Ridge siege. Weaver's presence drew immediate comparisons between the two cases, both involving armed standoffs, defiance of federal authority, and public sympathy from anti-government circles. His visit gave the Browns' cause added symbolic weight among militia and sovereign citizen groups, who saw them as part of the same lineage of resistance. Despite the mounting seriousness, the Browns treated much of the standoff with casual defiance. In July 2007, they hosted a full-scale event on the property, complete with live music and anti-government speeches. Attendees included well-known figures in the anti-tax movement and militia circles. The event was live-streamed and widely promoted through alternative media outlets. Still, months passed without violence. The standoff became a bizarre fixture in the national media, part protest, part fortress, part live-streamed rebellion. The Browns insisted they were lawful Americans defending their rights. The government saw armed fugitives sheltering on a weaponized compound and encouraging others to do the same. By September 2007, federal agents had enough. They began quietly developing an undercover operation, one that would rely not on brute force, but on deception. But as the weeks dragged on to the outside world, it appeared that the Browns were untouchable. Two people, convicted in federal court, daring the government to act and winning by default. The tension had reached a boiling point. The arrests hadn't come yet, but law enforcement was closing in. Ed and Elaine Brown weren't just hiding from the law. They believed they were upholding it. At the heart of their defiance was a deeply held conviction that the federal income tax, as enforced by the IRS, was unjust. This belief wasn't unique to them. For decades, a broad and persistent movement of so-called tax protesters has challenged the legality of income taxation in the United States. And while the courts have repeatedly rejected these arguments, understanding them is crucial to understanding what drove the Browns to risk everything. One of the foundational claims of the anti-tax movement is that the 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913 and commonly cited as the source of Congress's power to impose an income tax, was never properly ratified. This argument has been a cornerstone for tax protesters going back to the 1950s. However, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit dealt with this claim directly in United States v. Thomas in 1986, ruling it completely without merit and patently frivolous. The court reaffirmed that the 16th Amendment was properly ratified by more than the required number of states, and that any claims to the contrary held no legal weight. Another widely circulated argument is that wages earned through labor cannot be taxed because they represent an equal exchange of energy for compensation, a barter, rather than income. The Browns echoed this belief in various interviews, insisting that what one earns through honest work is not taxable gain. But this, too, has been struck down repeatedly. In United States v. Connor in 1990, the Third Circuit ruled that compensation for services paid in the form of wages is taxable income. The IRS has clarified this point extensively. All income earned by citizens, whether through wages, tips, or independent contracts, is taxable unless explicitly exempted by law. Then there's the Fifth Amendment argument. Some tax protesters claim that filing a tax return forces self-incrimination, thus violating constitutional protections. Ed Brown raised this in interviews, asking why a citizen should be compelled to declare earnings that might later be used against them in court. The Supreme Court tackled this issue in United States v. Sullivan in 1927, where it ruled that the obligation to file a return is constitutional. A citizen may invoke the Fifth Amendment regarding specific questions on the form, but they cannot use it as a blanket reason to avoid filing altogether. A fourth claim, and one Ed Brown strongly endorsed, is the idea that there is no actual law requiring an American citizen to pay federal income tax. The IRS, in its official response titled "The Truth About Frivolous Tax Arguments," identifies this as one of the most common and most consistently rejected claims in federal court. Courts have routinely upheld that Title 26 of the U.S. Code, the Internal Revenue Code, is valid federal law, passed by Congress and enforceable by the IRS. United States v. Burris in 1974 stated flatly, "The general rule is that income is taxable unless specifically exempted." Finally, some tax protesters assert that the IRS is not a legitimate federal agency, claiming it lacks the legal authority to collect taxes. The Browns hinted at this in statements, calling the IRS a rogue arm of the government with no constitutional grounding. The IRS is a bureau of the Department of the Treasury, created by an act of Congress in 1862 and reorganized under the 1952 Internal Revenue Code. Its authority to administer and enforce tax laws has been upheld in countless federal decisions. While Ed and Elaine Brown sincerely believed these ideas, every single one has been rejected in court, often multiple times. Their case became a rallying cry in certain circles, but legally, it followed a well-worn path. Individuals asserting theories about the Constitution that, however passionately argued, simply don't hold up in a court of law. And when challenged, the courts have been unequivocal. Belief is not a defense, but what if the entire system is illegitimate? By legal standards, the Browns were guilty. By moral standards, they were not. To truly understand what drove Ed and Elaine Brown, you have to set aside the Constitution, the tax code, even the courtroom. You have to go deeper into the idea that the entire structure of government is illegitimate because it exists without individual consent. This is not a mainstream political argument. It's a philosophical one. It finds its roots in natural law theory, in the writings of Lysander Spooner, Murray Rothbard, and the broader anarchist and libertarian positions. And it begins with a simple premise. No man has the right to rule another without consent. Under this view, government is not a protector, but a violator. It derives no moral authority from elections, laws, or majority rule, because none of those mechanisms justify coercion. If a citizen has never explicitly agreed to be governed, then all government action, especially taxation enforced at gunpoint, is inherently violent. For the Browns, this wasn't theory. It was their lived reality. In interviews, Ed Brown argued that the people have been deceived into participating in a system they never agreed to. He spoke of God-given rights, not granted by a constitution but by birth. In that worldview, the Constitution doesn't empower the state. It is a leash on it, and one that the government has long since slipped. Taxation, then, was only the tip of the spear. It represented a broader violation, the forced submission of free men and women to institutions they had never chosen. The IRS, the federal court system, even Congress itself, none had moral jurisdiction over someone who did not voluntarily enter into their contract. This line of thinking isn't fringe in every corner of American thought. It echoes in the Declaration of Independence itself, where Jefferson wrote that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The anarchist asks, what if consent is missing? And what happens when withdrawal of that consent is met not with dialogue, but with guns? There's also a deeper irony. In this worldview, appealing to the courts for validation is pointless, because the courts are a branch of the very system being challenged. As Spooner wrote in 1852, the judiciary, as a branch of the government, cannot be impartial between the government and a person accused by the government. And to those like Ed Brown, that wasn't just a critique, it was a warning. To challenge taxation in this framework isn't just a legal dispute, it's an existential one. You're not just arguing over dollars and paperwork. You're challenging the legitimacy of the entire apparatus that rules your life. Ed and Elaine Brown lived out this philosophy. They withdrew consent. They refused to participate. And when the consequences came, they bore them not as criminals, but as dissidents. Whether you see them as patriots or extremists, one thing is undeniable. Their story forces a deeper question, not about tax rates or enforcement procedures, but about power, and whether it can ever be just without permission. By late summer 2007, the Browns' property in Plainfield, New Hampshire, was no longer just a refuge. It had become a fortress and a symbol. With federal arrest warrants outstanding, Ed and Elaine Brown had entrenched themselves in their hilltop home for more than 6 months. From inside, they gave interviews to alternative media, live-streamed updates, and doubled down on their claim. The United States government had no authority to tax their labor. As the standoff dragged on, law enforcement began targeting the Brown support network. Several individuals who had visited the property were arrested and charged with aiding fugitives, transporting weapons, and obstruction. Their removal isolated the Browns, cutting off the steady stream of food, supplies, and reinforcement that had helped sustain their resistance. In early October 2007, U.S. Marshals posed as supporters sympathetic to the Browns' anti-tax cause. They reached out through back-channel communications and were invited onto the property by the couple themselves. The agents, dressed in civilian clothes, gained access to the home by posing as allies. Once inside, the Browns were surrounded. There was no firefight, no final act of defiance. After months of preparations, Ed and Elaine Brown were arrested in their kitchen, surprised, unarmed, and outmaneuvered. For the Browns supporters, the arrest marked the end of something larger than a standoff. It was the collapse of a last stand, one that, in their view, challenged the legitimacy of federal authority itself. To the government, it was the lawful apprehension of 2 convicted felons. To their followers, it was the silencing of dissent. The months-long siege of Plainfield was over, but the legal and cultural aftershocks were just beginning. The federal government made sure that Ed and Elaine Brown didn't just lose their freedom, it made an example of them. After their arrest in October 2007, the Browns were indicted on a new wave of federal charges. But this time, it wasn't just about unpaid taxes. This time, the weight of the full system came crashing down. The couple was charged with conspiracy to impede federal officers, obstruction of justice, and possession of destructive devices, offenses that carried decades in prison. The message was clear: resist, and you will be crushed. At trial, prosecutors focused not on the Browns' beliefs, but on their preparations. During a search of their property, federal agents uncovered stockpiled weapons, surveillance equipment, and homemade explosives. The court was shown photos of trenches dug into the earth, booby traps disguised in forest brush, and motion-triggered devices wired into entryways. These were not symbolic tools of protest, the government argued. They were tools of war. And the punishment followed suit. In 2009, Ed Brown was sentenced to 37 years in federal prison. Elaine Brown received 35 years. Both were in their 60s. For all intents and purposes, the government had given them a death sentence, not for killing anyone, not for firing a shot, but for refusing to kneel and daring to fortify themselves against state enforcement. Following their convictions for tax evasion and related offenses, the federal government seized Ed and Elaine Brown's assets, including their 100-acre Plainfield, New Hampshire compound, and Elaine's dental office in Lebanon. These properties were auctioned in 2015, with the compound selling for $205,000 and the dental office for $415,000. The proceeds were intended to cover unpaid federal taxes and local property taxes. However, the town of Plainfield received only $36,334 from the sale, far less than the $232,661 it claimed in unpaid taxes and assessments. Town officials expressed frustration, noting that the federal government prioritized its claims, leaving insufficient funds to cover local debts. Additionally, federal agents had previously seized Elaine Brown's dental office during the standoff, further consolidating government control over the couple's assets. For over a decade, they remained behind bars, but the legal story wasn't over. In 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling in United States v. Davis, striking down part of the federal statute used to enhance the Brown sentences. The law had allowed longer prison terms based on so-called crimes of violence, but the court found that the statute's definition was too vague, unconstitutional. For the Browns, this opened a door. Elaine walked through it first. In 2020, a federal judge resentenced her to time served and ordered her release. After more than 12 years in prison, she was freed. At the hearing, she expressed remorse, telling the court she was ashamed of what she had done and no longer wanted to be associated with the movement that had landed her there. But critics of the system saw it differently. A 60-year-old woman was sent to federal prison for over a decade, not for hurting anyone, but for defending her home and challenging the federal tax system. And now she had to apologize in open court to be allowed to go free. Ed Brown also sought resentencing, arguing that the legal framework that put him away had now been deemed flawed. He cited his age, declining health, and the principle that justice should be consistent, even for dissidents. But in 2022, the First Circuit Court of Appeals denied his request. His 25-year sentence remained intact. In its ruling, the court made no apology for the outcome, emphasizing the seriousness of his defiance and the need to deter others from similar resistance. For those who believe in state supremacy, the result was a victory. The law had prevailed. The enforcers of the system had prevailed. But for those who see the Browns as political prisoners, citizens punished for rejecting the legitimacy of a coercive tax system, the real story isn't about explosives or evasion. It's about what happens when you challenge authority with more than words. You don't get a debate, you get a cage. In 2023, the IRS closed 582,944 tax return audits, resulting in $31.9 billion in additional tax due. Conveniently, they don't publish data on how many personal residences they seize every year. As to whether or not the federal government has the authority to tax you, well, they certainly think so. So do the courts, which happen to be a branch of the federal government. So where does that leave ordinary people like you and me? I guess we all have to make individual choices that are best for ourselves and our families. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. As always, thanks for watching.